Usually, I have to say, and I guess she's bailed out on me, but I'm the warm-up act for Sandy Rios. So to have her as the warm-up act is really a privilege and a blessing. Expect she's already given you all the good stuff, though. So having heard this lady talking about the depressing stuff, I'm here to supply that. So we're going to talk about this, Islamic supremacism, and my earpiece is not really going to cooperate with me here. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is one of my favorite people, and I had the privilege, as you may know, of having worked for him for about 4.5 years when I was a child. Um, and he said long before that, I mean, I was really a child, but in 1961 he began making this point, as he has done through most of his career, that we face existential threats to freedom. That's history, really. And that is true today as well. And I'll come back to this in a bit. But let's go to the next slide. So, what is it that is the danger we're facing? Where did Bill go? Bill, could I use that mic instead of this thing? It's going to drive me crazy. Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. So the guy here on the left, you may remember, fondly or not, used to call what we're up against terrorism, which was a euphemism that wasn't, frankly, all that clarifying as to the nature of the existential threat. But this guy on the right, who I think you are aware of, has actually made it even more opaque, more unclear what the problem is. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about what violent extremism is and how it relates to this existential threat. Next slide. Well, you know these characters. Here you have co-religionists being, a moment later, beheaded en masse on a beach, as I recall, in Libya. So the Islamic State qualifies, but next slide. It's not just over there. They have people, and we've been told that they're lone wolves. You may also know we've been told that they don't actually have anything to do with Islam. They, sort of are sick and all that. They're sick, all right, but they're not really lone wolves. In just about every case, one of my colleagues, Patrick Poole, has recently done a piece at PJ Media pointing out that in 12 out of 13 attacks in this country by these so-called lone wolves, they've actually been known wolves. The FBI has known who these characters were. In some cases, they were actually, monitoring their activities. They were interrogating them, and then they didn't. They let them go. They stopped monitoring. So we get the disastrous results like these folks inflicted in San Bernardino and in Orlando in 2015 and 2016. Next slide. But it turns out there's a whole bunch of other violent extremists abroad in the world. This is hardly an exhaustive list. Most of them are names that you may have heard once or twice, but probably aren't terribly familiar with. But suffice it to say that all of these people, as well as the Islamic State, have something in common. Next slide. They call it Sharia. Are you familiar with that term? If you've been hanging around with Bill, I know you are, but I'm going to spend a little time telling you about it anyway. About 10%, by some estimates, of this corpus of Sharia has to do with defining religious practice for Muslims. How often you pray, in which direction you pray, what you say when you pray, washing, eating, other things that govern what we would all think of as sort of pietistic practice. Next slide. The trouble is that, let me just go back for a moment because I'm missing a slide. I think this is my fault, not your machine, but the point is that there is another 90% that's out there that we have to worry about. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But let me just say for this interlude. Next slide. There are Muslims in our country, particularly, and this happens to be a friend of mine, and I admire very much, Zuhdi Jasser. You've probably seen him on Fox and elsewhere, who does not embrace Sharia as something that defines his faith tradition. He's actually put together with a number of other reformers what he calls the Muslim Reform Manifesto. And kind of like Martin Luther, I didn't get a chance to see what church I'm in, but I imagine it's along those lines. He nailed on one of the Islamic Society mosques in Washington, D.C., this Reform Manifesto, basically calling out these guys and challenging them to repudiate the things about Sharia that are absolutely abominable. And I'll tell you more about those in a moment. But then there are all these characters, millions of these characters, who actually think Islam is Sharia and vice versa, and that it's their duty to impose it on everybody else. Their God-directed duty at that. Next slide. So there is a patina of religiosity. Those are fancy words, but you know what I mean. It's kind of a veneer that actually obscures, for many people, the totalitarian ideology that's underneath it. Next slide. That's it. That's what, stop there. It is a political and military and legal program. Okay, this is at the core of the bulk of Sharia. And it is intended, and not just intended, it is obligatory that it governs every facet of the lives of the faithful Muslims. Again, I want to be clear. I believe there are quite a number of Muslims who don't want to have their lives governed by or be subordinated to Sharia any more than we do. But they just don't happen to be the authorities of the faith. And they don't happen to be the guys who are driving that agenda, that program of imposing Sharia worldwide. Next slide. So, this is kind of the point of all of this. If we understand that what we're up against in Sharia is a totalitarian and, in fact, seditious ideology, by which I mean something that is explicitly supposed to supplant systems of government, for example, like our Constitution, then we actually have a basis upon which we can defend ourselves against it. In fact, the laws of the United States make it illegal to be trying to supplant the Constitution of the United States. That is sedition. But, next slide, if we persist in doing what we have been doing, certainly since 9/11, and arguably long before that, we're going to find that we're doomed because we are protecting as a religion this seditious ideology. And it will take us down if we do persist in that. Because they are all about not just replacing the Constitution, but destroying the nation and enslaving those who do not convert to Islam. I know this is an important point. If you happen to be a person of the book, as they say, Christians and Jews, you actually get three options. You can convert to Islam, you can die, or you can agree to submit to what's called a sort of dhimmi status. Think of it as enslavement. It's not really just a second-class citizen. It is someone who lives like a slave at the sufferance of the master. And if they decide for whatever reason that you need not survive any longer, you're done. So if you don't actually have the distinction of being Christian or Jew, you only get two options: convert or die. But either way, it's a pretty unappetizing set. Next slide. So let me get to the meat of this subject, because this is the part that gets very dangerous. Those violent jihadists believe that it is their duty to engage in terrifying acts to try to accomplish the goals established by Muhammad and laid out in Sharia. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides, and the first is going to be the most familiar one. Next slide. It's what violent jihad looks like, and this is sort of the iconic photograph. We'll always remember it. I think all of us, at least, who lived through it. It's the preferred form of jihad. Muhammad himself practiced it. He showed that it was incredibly effective. The more terrifying, the more you can actually compel people to submit. And that's the whole point of the exercise. Next slide. To go back to this point about lone wolves, it's not just groups or even nations that can engage in jihad. It is the duty of every single faithful Muslim to do it. So if you are unable to do it as part of a team or a group, you still are supposed to do it. So you get shootings like this at the Orlando Gay Bar. It's not something that is, a hijacking of the faith. It is not something that is unrelated to the program of Sharia. It is part and parcel of the tradition going back to Muhammad's time. Next slide. But what I want to show you are a couple of other kinds of jihad that if basically you're not in a position to engage in the violent kind, or maybe you just, don't have it in you, you still have an obligation to do in one or the other of these forms. This is a photograph. I'm sure you've seen scenes like this coming at us daily now, practically from Europe. One of my colleagues coined this phrase, refugee-hod, as a way of capturing it. But the way the Muslim tradition describes it is called hijra, which you may be familiar with. The first hijra was Muhammad's when he met resistance in Mecca, where he was poor and essentially powerless, and was ultimately found intolerable by the people who ran it, Christians and Jews. And he made the hijra to Medina, where he became, over time, both rich through marrying a wealthy woman, widow, and powerful by getting revelations from God, Allah, saying, go raid caravans, which made him immensely popular with a lot of folks who realized that booty was a lot more fun to get, slaves and sex slaves and the works, rather than working. So he actually developed a following. He developed an army. He became a great warrior. But it started with that hijra. And ever since, Muslims have been told it is one of the forms of fulfilling your duty to migrate, to colonize, to establish Islam in the non-Islamic world known as the Dar al-Harb. Not to be confused with the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, the nations of Islam. Dar al-Harb is the house of war. So it is your duty to go spread Sharia, spread Islam, spread jihad to that non-Muslim world. And it is coming here, make no mistake about it. Next slide. This is a little bit of a messed up slide, but the point is it's a bit of a messed up situation. Among the people who are now selling and otherwise infusing into our society toxic chemical substances in the form of narcotics of one kind or another are jihadists. Not well known by most of us, but in Latin America there are lots of other non-jihadists But increasingly, the non-jihadists are working with the jihadists. Notably, two of the groups that I showed you on one of those early slides, Hamas and Hezbollah, who have built immense capabilities to move drugs around and are now funding much of their jihadist enterprises through the sale of these drugs. And I just want to call particular attention to this last point because, as you may know, among mischief that will quite possibly be made when Congress regrettably returns to town for what is known as a lame duck session. This is when most of the mischief of Congress is done because they've already gotten through the election and many of them are simply no longer accountable to you. But it's a great opportunity to see what they can do to endear themselves to future employers. So all kinds of nonsense is in the cards. But one of the ones that I'm particularly concerned about, I have to tell you, is something called criminal justice reform. And that sounds like a good thing, basically, doesn't it? I mean, you don't want people punished who don't deserve to be punished. But this is essentially a fraud, ladies and gentlemen, because what the Congress is about to do, unless you discourage them, is to begin letting out of jail people who are not innocents. People who are not even what they say they are, which is people who have been unduly punished for non-violent drug offenses. One of Sandy and my friends, Andy McCarthy, a terrific former federal prosecutor, has made the point that under the laws of the United States, drug trafficking is an inherently violent activity. I mean, for one thing, you're selling stuff that kills people. And for another, you often kill people in the course of selling the stuff that kills people. You're, at the very least, you're using, weapons and threats and other things. So you add on top of the fact that this criminal justice reform initiative is going to let lots of these people, probably tens of thousands of these people, who in federal prison, I mean, one of the other little frauds is that they say, well, these are people who just got caught, with a dime bag of dope or something. Not in federal prison. In federal prison, these are kingpins. Bruce can attest to this, I'm sure, Sandy's husband. These are people who are hardened criminal drug traffickers. And just to tie this back into the point of this little presentation, many of them are converting to jihad in jail. Did you know that? We actually, under President Bill Clinton, gave the job of identifying, recruiting, training, and credentialing Muslim chaplains to one of the top Muslim Brotherhood operatives in the United States. A guy who, on top of that, was actually subsequently determined to have been a top financier of Al-Qaeda. Now, the good news is he's in jail himself on terrorism charges. Bad news is his imams are still servicing prisoners in our penitentiaries. So there are more jihadists coming, and they'll be on the street if this bill passes. Next slide, please. Another kind of jihad is called zakat. Now, sometimes this is described as tithing, which, in the Christian tradition, everybody gets as sort of a voluntary contribution. This isn't a voluntary contribution. Think of this as more of a tax, something you were obliged to give to charity. And of the 8 prescribed purposes for which that charitable contribution can be made, depending on who's doing the counting, at least 1, and arguably as many as 4 of the 8, go to fund jihad. Now, I happen to have on the slide here something called Simply Sharia. Cute little name. Simply Sharia, a wealth management firm. I just pull it out of, Google, but it's part of what is now estimated to be $1 trillion a year industry. This is an industry that involves sort of creating a parallel universe to free enterprise Western capitalist economics. And what these guys are doing is they're saying you have to do investing in ways that we consider to be, well, if you'll forgive the phrase, kosher, halal, pure, not ways that we consider to be haram or impure. And it gets complicated, but the short, sort of simple way to think of it is that the guys who conjured this up, and by the way, this doesn't go back 1,400 years. This is something that they invented in the past 50. But the guys who conjured it up say you can't charge interest for transactions. Well, there's no way you're going to get people to invest with you if you don't give them some compensation for the time value of money. But the point is, what they do with this trillion-dollar industry is they spin off zakat. With $1 trillion under management, that's a lot of material support for terrorism. And it's happening in our country, not just elsewhere around the world. Our government has thought, hey, this is a really cool way to recycle some of those dollars that we have insanely been sending to people who are trying to kill us in the name of Sharia, in the form of purchases of their oil and gas. So that's another form of jihad. But let me turn to the last and in some ways most important one. Next slide. There's something called civilization jihad. And some have described this as a kind of non-violent jihad. But I think of it actually more like pre-violent jihad. And the folks who are the prime practitioners of this, the folks who actually coined the term civilization jihad, are the Muslim Brotherhood. And I just want to talk to you for a few minutes about the Muslim Brotherhood, because these are the characters that worry me most in this whole enterprise. Because frankly, we're not perfect, but we're reasonably good at dealing with violent threats. At least when we can understand them and address them properly. What we're terrible at is dealing with pre-violent threats. Let me give you some examples. Next slide. This handy little book, and we have copies of it outside for you, is, I consider it to be the single most important book written about the jihad. And I wish I could say I wrote it, but I didn't. The Muslim Brotherhood wrote it. And as people of faith, I just have to share with you one of those incredible evidences of divine providence. In 2004, down in the neck of the woods where I live, I'm quite sure where Sandy lives, but she spends some of her time down not too far from the eastern shore of Maryland, and maybe some of you have been across a beautiful artery that goes over it called the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, down to the eastern shore over the Chesapeake Bay. Well, one fine day, an alert Maryland Transportation Authority police officer observed a couple driving across the bridge. And it's not uncommon by any means, as people go over this beautiful span and this incredible seascape, they'll whip out a camera and they'll take pictures of it. Well, he saw the woman in the car, the passenger, taking pictures all right, only he noticed that she was taking pictures of the structural supports of the bridge. Being a trained police officer, he thought that didn't look right. Now, full disclosure, she was wearing a hijab, and it would be profiling if that's why he was observing her, but I'm sure he didn't do that. But he did observe her taking pictures of the structural supports of the bridge, which led to the police officer pulling them over, running their IDs, establishing that the driver of the car, husband of the woman, was wanted on a material witness arrest warrant out of Chicago in connection with material support for terrorism. Specifically, raising funds for one of those groups I mentioned early on, a designated terrorist group called Hamas. Well, that gave rise to a search warrant which some of Bruce's colleagues executed on their home not too far from where I live, in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., sleepy little suburban community called Annandale. And they went into this house, and it was literally chock-a-block with banker boxes worth of documents, some 80 of them, as I understand it, that on inspection and translation turned out to be the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America. How do you like them apples? Hand of God. Never would have found those things otherwise. Well, when they went through those boxes, one of the things they tumbled upon was this report written by a top Muslim Brotherhood operative back to the mothership in Egypt, describing what the brothers had been up to for the previous 25 years in the United States and how they were coming with what he called the civilization jihad. Next slide. The money quote of which is this: the mission of the Muslim Brotherhood is a kind of grand jihad in destroying and eliminating Western civilization from within by their hands, meaning ours, and the hands of the believers, so that Allah's religion is made victorious over all other religions. Now, I don't know about you. I don't consider that particularly friendly. In fact, I think that's a threat. And when you read through this, and I really encourage you to do it, and once you do, I encourage you to give it to everybody else you know, and in particular people who are supposed to be representing you in places like Washington, or in Lansing for that matter. Because this program is 25 years further on from where it was when this report was written in 1991. In other words, for about 50 years, these guys, like termites, have been working on what they call civilization jihad. Let me show you the next slide, give you a little sense of what that is. It basically comes down to this second bullet. They've been building the infrastructure with which to wage that pre-violent jihad. And what makes it so dangerous is, you remember I showed you those slides of those so-called lone wolves? Well, as Patrick Poole points out, not only were all of them known, just about, to the law enforcement authorities, but all of them, I believe, are associated with one or the other of these mosques. You know, this always sort of comes out late in the conversation. First of all, there's no ties to terrorism here, folks. Nothing to see. Move along. And then, oh, well, yeah, maybe it is terrorism, but it has nothing to do with Islam. And then, oh, well, maybe the guy, is a convert or recently started going to mosque, but nobody at the mosque ever knew him, never saw him, was incredulous. He wasn't the guy that they knew, for sure, if they did say they know him. Well, this is the Brotherhood at work, folks. They actually have, and one of the really helpful things about this, the old line about you can't tell players without the scorecard. In the report back to the mothership, on pages 30 and 31 of this little print, 31 and 32. They have a list of 29 groups under the heading Our Organizations and Organizations of Our Friends. Imagine what they could accomplish if they all march according to a single plan. Again, kind of a clue that these are folks who are seriously pursuing in an organized, disciplined way the building out of that infrastructure to run operations against our country. So they have successfully penetrated a lot of it, and they have enlisted as helpmates in advancing their civilization jihad the left, the media, academia you could throw in there too, and our government. Next slide. Back to these guys. Under the influence of the Brotherhood, I would argue, you had things said like this. Islam is a religion of peace. Remember that? And then this is one of my favorites. The United States is not at war with Islam. It never will be. Unsaid is the operative point, which is that Islam, or at least those Muslims who adhere to Sharia, are absolutely at war with us. Next slide. But when you get the Muslim Brotherhood telling you what you can say and think and know and do as advisors to the United States government, one of our colleagues, again, Sandy's mine, Rich Higgins, until recently, not so recently, but past couple of years, was a senior executive in the Defense Department. Worked during the Bush administration, worked during the first years of the Obama administration. He said, when the Bush administration was running things, the Muslim Brotherhood was in the room. Under Obama, the Muslim Brotherhood is running the meetings. And this is the kind of thing you get out of that. Nothing to see here, folks, except violent extremism. And you know who they think are the violent extremists? Next slide. You. No, not you. I'm going to come to that. You. This is actually got 4 of these slides. These are the most important slides of this whole pitch. So if you've stayed awake till now, thank you. This is the theory that the Muslim Brotherhood has been propounding. That there's a fault line, if you will, a division between a little bitty group of people who are the enemy. Those are those nasty, violent extremists. And then there's Islam, the religion of peace. And they are all our friends. They don't want any of this violent stuff. Next slide. So where does the Brotherhood fit in that particular paradigm? Well, because we're told they eschew violence, they're on the right side. So we can safely, responsibly, and constructively rely on them to help us, as I say, know and see and do and all that. Next slide. This is the point I was trying to get at. So who is the greatest threat according to the Muslim Brotherhood? Now, next slide. You. Does this sound familiar? Conservatives, anti-abortion people, returning veterans, Tea Party people. These are the people, mark my words, that you will be seeing targeted in a Hillary Clinton administration. Next slide. Back to this different paradigm. My theory, and I think this is the correct way to think about it, is that there is a fault line, to be sure, between people who are potentially our friends, not a certitude, but potentially our friends, and people who are implacably our enemies, unalterably our enemies. And it doesn't have to do with violence, because as we've talked about, you can be all about violence, you can be about Hydra, you can be about drug trafficking, you can be about zakat, you can be about civilization jihad. It's all jihad, but it doesn't have to be violent. But what it does have to be is in support of promoting Sharia around the world, imposing it on everybody. Next slide. Where do the Muslim Brothers turn up when that fault line is used? They're actually on the wrong side. They're part of the problem. They are a threat, not helpmates, not people that you can rely upon, except to slit your throat if they can, because like Hamas, which is, as I mentioned, a designated terrorist group, you may or may not know this, but Hamas is actually the Muslim Brotherhood franchise in the Palestinian areas. So it's not that they eschew violence, it's just that they don't think they're strong enough to use it here yet. That's where that infrastructure building goes forward to get them to that point, because it is the most efficient way to do it at the right time. Next slide. So I'm getting to the end. Are you good? A little bit more? Okay. This is a little bit of good news. We actually have had some folks on Capitol Hill starting to pay attention to this, starting to actually hold hearings on it, starting to drill down on the Muslim Brotherhood specifically, and the phenomenon of willful blindness. And this is the poster child of the willfully blind. He is the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security at the moment. He turned up 2 days after Senator Cruz had a terrific hearing in which he just clinically demonstrated this is a problem. And Jay Johnson, in a manner that can only be described as unbelievably contemptuous, essentially said he didn't give a rat's about what Senator Cruz had established. Completely indifferent to it. Next slide. Well, that may be because some of the people, and I'm sorry the slide's a little messed up again, but some of the people he's hanging out with are the number 1 and number 2 groups on this list. The Muslim Students Association, the first organization the Muslim Brotherhood established in this country in the 1960s, now operating on 500 or more of our campuses, folks, where they are recruiting your kids, or if not your kids, other people's kids. And they're proselytizing. And if they can bring them to jihad, they will. And then there's this is the Students Association. That was last year. This is this year. This is just Labor Day weekend. He went to the largest Muslim Brotherhood front organization, the Islamic Society of North America, number 1 on the list. And when asked subsequently, actually, his spokesman was asked, did the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security know that the Islamic Society of North America, like most of the other groups on this list, was an unindicted co-conspirator in the largest terrorism financing trial in U.S. history, the Holy Land Foundation trial? And the answer came back, yes, the Secretary certainly did know that. But it didn't matter because he wanted to reach out to Muslims. And there were 10,000 or so of them there at that particular convention. And the trouble is, the 10,000 or so Muslims that were in that meeting are, I would venture to say, without exception, not Zuhdi Jasser Muslims. They're not welcome in those meetings. In fact, they're considered to be apostates. It's actually hazardous to their health not to be Sharia adherent in a Sharia adherent party. And the rest of them, I would venture, are either Brotherhood or sympathetic to. So, Kaiser Khan, yes, thank you for that. Kaiser Khan, of course, was the person that you see there with his quiet wife next to him, pledging allegiance, I believe, prior to tearing into Donald Trump for being a hater and a bigot, for not wanting us to import more jihadists. Which prompted Donald Trump, in his inimitable fashion, to go back after him and The rest, as they say, is history. But yes, Kaiser Khan is one of those who was a featured speaker now on the roadshow of these Muslim Brotherhood front groups, along with the Secretary of Homeland Security. Next slide. So this is just a picture of that list that's in the back of this, and I just made that point. Jay Johnson's pals. Next slide. This is a good man to know. Scott Perry, I think he's a comer. He's represents people of, I can't remember the district number, but in Pennsylvania. He is currently the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee's Oversight Subcommittee, and he had a hearing similar to the one that Senator Cruz had in June, just in September, and confirmed again what I've just been sharing with you. Willful blindness is the order of the day. In fact, Andy McCarthy says it's gotten to a point where it's actually compulsory blindness. Because, and I don't want to put Bruce on the spot, but it's now the case that if you are in law enforcement, if you're in the military, if you are in the intelligence community, if you're in the Department of Homeland Security, you are not allowed to know what I've just shared with you. It is a career-threatening, if not ending, offense to do so. To even ask questions about it, let alone study up on it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is just a symptom of that Muslim Brotherhood influence, I believe, and why we've got, as the order of the day, instead, chase after those violent extremists. In fact, you've seen, I'm sure, our friend Seb Gorka on Fox and other outlets. Seb tells a story, you may have heard him do this, that he was at a speech, I guess somewhat like this, only it was sort of an 8-hour training program for military and other government personnel. And he went through something along these lines, I think. And at the end of the program, a pretty young woman, he says, come up to him out of the crowd and says, Dr. Gorka, this is all very interesting. But you know that the real threat of violent extremism is from right-wing extremists. And he was a little taken aback, and then she handed him her card, and she was an employee of the Department of Homeland Security. So this is what our friends on the Hill are finally getting around to turning up. Next slide. I'm really at the end. I just want you to be aware of this. When I said, and from the gasps, I think you took it seriously, I'm seriously putting you on notice that Hillary Clinton will be using, among other techniques, something she calls shaming and peer pressure to stop us from talking about the sorts of things that I've shared with you tonight. And that's actually the best case. Next slide. What she was involved in when she was in the State Department. In fact, I think it was the first diplomatic initiative of the Obama-Clinton first term, was the adoption by something called the UN Human Rights Council of a resolution called 1618, which actually starts out, I'm sorry, this is a bad slide again, prohibiting defamation of Islam. They subsequently thought that was a little too direct, so they changed it to defamation of religion. But as you know, there's only one religion you can't defame. You can defame Christians all day long, Jews, heavens knows, Hindus, Zoroastrians, but not these guys. And so, next slide, if you wind up getting to the point where, as Resolution 1618 calls for, every member of the United Nations to prohibit expression that offends or defames Islam, and to criminalize it so that it is punishable, you very quickly get this turned into hate speech, which under the laws of the United States is actually a criminal offense. So I don't mean to suggest that shaming and peer pressure isn't bad enough. I think it is bad enough. There's a lot of it going around. I've been called some terrible things myself, as you may know. Islamophobe being one of them. But the next step that I think is just a linear extrapolation from where we've gotten to already. Notably, if Loretta Lynch winds up, perhaps because of that little conversation that she had with Bill Clinton, being Attorney General for the next President of the United States, it may well be that she gets to do what she said she was going to do after that attack in Orlando. Do you remember this? She expressed her concern, her I think most serious or some form of expression like that, her greatest concern was that Muslims were going to be victimized in the aftermath of that attack. And she was going to look at what could be done to prosecute people who would say things that would inflame hostility towards Muslims. So this is unfortunately a problem. And if you think maybe what I'm saying is either impossible, because we, after all, have a First Amendment to the Constitution which says freedom of speech is guaranteed, right? Or you simply think I'm indulging in a little partisan hyperbole. Look at Europe. Because not only is it awash with people making the hijra, who are becoming increasingly aggressive because they now think what the Russians used to call the correlation of forces is moving in the direction where what had previously been impossible, namely violent jihad, is becoming possible. But they've also already gotten the Europeans to submit to Resolution 1618 in a whole variety of laws. Friends of mine are being prosecuted and convicted of speech in Europe today along the lines of what I just shared with you. And this can happen. It may not happen quite the way it happened in Europe because they don't have a constitution. Most certainly they don't have a First Amendment. But it is inexorably moving that way. And that's one of the reasons why so much is at stake in this election. Next slide, which gets me to this point. What do we do about this? This is where I walked in on Sandy, and she was doing an admirable job of explaining. These are my thoughts on it. First of all, you've got to get smart on this, and I think you already have gotten pretty far up the learning curve. But you've got to understand that there are different aspects to this jihad. It's not just violent extremism, for heaven's sake, or even just violent jihad. It's all of these other elements that in synergy are being used against Western civilization. We got to figure out how to counter them. I've got some thoughts on it. I'll share them with you in a moment. I think we've got to offer the American people an alternative. More on that in a moment. Well, it comes down to the next commander-in-chief to some extent. Next slide, please. So let me just share with you some things that Donald Trump laid out in August, which I think really represent the single most articulate, thoughtful, and sound exposition alternative to what has been the Obama program and, frankly, the Bush program before it. So just key parts of it. He focused in on the enemy. He's using a term different than jihad or Sharia adherent Muslims, but radical Islam sort of captures the thought. He specifically cited Sharia as the ideology that is undermining us and would supplant our Constitution if it could. He talks about the need for a counter-ideological strategy. It's not enough to just try to stop bad guys from blowing things up. You've got to get at what animates them too. You need to bring all instruments of national power. As I mentioned, I had the privilege of working for President Reagan when he took down the last totalitarian ideology that tried to destroy this country, Soviet communism. We've done actually a booklet. I think there's examples of it out there. And by the way, if you want to order any of these, you can do so. This one and a number of others that you'll find outside. Or if you just want to go online at securefreedom.org. Download them for free and come into them too. But one of the books that we've done is taking the template of Reagan's strategy for defeating Soviet communism and applying it to this ideology, to our time's existential threat. Trump talked about that, so-called Muslim ban. It was about keeping people who don't share our values, and worse, want to destroy them, want to supplant them, want to make us submit to their program, keep them out of our country. It's a little known fact, ladies and gentlemen. They don't have a right to come here. We actually have not only the right, we have ample precedent for saying thanks but no thanks. We actually don't want you here if you want us to be like you instead of you becoming part of the fabric of America. And this is the last point, and really critical given what I was sharing with you before about these guys. He actually talked about going after the networks that are radicalizing people within the Muslim community. That's a breakthrough, folks, because finally somebody at his level, presidential candidate for crying out loud, actually acknowledged this is going on. So, last slide, I think. Oh, no, I've got to walk you through this very quickly because the question did come up even though I wasn't here. What do you do? You've got to get clear about the enemy. This jihadist ideology and Islamic supremacism are the problem. Next slide. Learn about, and again, there's a whole passel of books about what you can do, what you can actually do, what you personally can actually do to help with this. So check them out, please. Next slide. Obviously, Sandy sort of alluded to this. There are some of us that are in this fight. If you'd like to help us, that's a way of contributing to it. We would welcome it. Next slide. Here's a couple of specific things that I would recommend for you to think about doing. Next slide. For 2.5 more weeks, people who represent you are going to be keenly interested in what you think. It's a different business after that, but for the next 2.5 weeks, you've got their attention. Take advantage of it. Ask them if they've read this. If they haven't, insist that they do it. Good idea for you to have looked at it before you do that, but share it with them, because I will guarantee you practically none of them even know about this book, let alone how revealing it is. Next slide. We're going to run off the page here, I'm afraid. This is a huge problem. Donald Trump is complaining bitterly about what the media is doing to him, but what the media is doing to people like Zuhdi Jasser is every bit as scandalous. He's just, Zuhdi, by the way, just this week has written to leaders of the mainstream media saying, what you're doing by exclusively using Muslim Brotherhood operatives as leaders or spokespeople for representatives of the Muslim community is you're actually enhancing their influence and stature within our community, and you're making our job of pro-American, anti-Sharia Muslims infinitely more difficult. So again, to the extent you're talking on talk radio or to editorial board writers, sending letters to the editor, this is a point to be made. The media needs to understand that Sharia is not the only form of Islam. It is the authoritative form, I'll give you that, but it is not one we should be building up, or its practitioners. Next slide. This seems self-evident, but it's happening. I mean, I don't know how many of you have got school-age kids, but it is happening. It's now part of Common Core. It's now part of textbooks that are used by most of our schools. And if this hasn't already come to your attention, the hard left's march through the institutions, as they call it, has already done a pretty good job of taking us down. I mean, if you look at millennials these days, I think it's pretty clear, let alone kids that are younger, how serious this problem is. But you overlay it with Islamists who are using the same techniques to propagandize our kids. It's a really serious problem for the future as well. And there's another slide, but I don't remember what it says because it's off the page. But anyway, do that too. Next slide. So back to Reagan. Just final word. This was the money quote of that particular passage. You're here, I warrant, because you don't want to be reduced to telling your children and your children's children what it was like to live in the United States when it was free. Am I right? Okay. So if you don't want to do that, you have to engage. And you have to engage your kids harder. But you have to do it. You have to engage your neighbors. You have to engage your loved ones in this existential threat to freedom in our time, just as our forefathers did it in previous generations, because we won't pass it on to them through the bloodstream. So let's go do that, okay? Last slide, I'm done. Thank you.